Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for joining me today. This is our Movers and Shakers program. Sorry about that. In total, we're going to be discussing, let me get this slideshow started here. In total, we are going to be discussing 4 different Pendleton Countyans who, as I like to say, stirred the waters and made a mark on the world, or at least the world they lived in. They have a place in history for their time. The 4 that we are going to, before I go on, we're going to discuss 4 people total, as I already said. The 4 men are Christian Hagemyer, Joseph M. Lowe, Samuel T. Hauser, and Luther M. Kennett. I've divided this into 2 segments, so today we're going to cover the first 2, Christian Hagemyer and Joseph Macaulay Lowe. On Saturday, the other program, or the other half, is going to be posted, and it will cover Hauser and Kennett. So we're going to start here with C.C. Hagemyer is leading off. Here's kind of a brief outline of what I'm going to cover in terms of his life, his early and late life, the Licking River and Mining Company, Butler Mills, and he was married twice, so we're going to talk a little bit about each of those marriages. Christian C. Hagemyer was born in Bremen, Germany, the 12th of April, 1849. He immigrated to America when he was 5 years old, so that would be about 1854, 55. They came with his parents and they settled in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was employed by a wholesale grocer in Cincinnati when he was approached by a Licking River and Mining Company executive who offered him a position and a chance to learn the business. The Licking River and Mining Company had extensive holdings in the Eastern Kentucky mountains. They had a large sawmill and general offices at Boston Station, which we today call just Boston. They're on 27 as you're going into Butler. So we'll start with the Licking River and Mining Company. The sawmill was built at Boston sometime before 1860. It was built on the Covington and Lexington Railroad. After some time, well, as I said, they sent Christian Hagemyer to Eastern Kentucky, and after he spent some time there, he then transferred to Boston. This is a picture of him. It appeared in one of the local papers. I want to say maybe the Guide. I'm not real sure about that. But that's what he looked like. This picture is not a picture of the operation, but it is a picture of a lumber yard from about the same time frame that Hagemyer would have been in the lumber business. So it's possible that his lumber yard looked quite a bit like this. An interesting kind of side note that I ran across from researching was that the town of Boston was built by the Licking River and Mining Company. Most of the stockholders in the company lived in Boston as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The organization had a large timber holding on the upper part of the Licking River. One source I found said that logs were floated loose downstream and then moved by rail to Boston. Another reference said that logs were floated all the way to Boston and then gotten out of the river here. My guess is that they probably did both, depending on the time frame and how far the logs were coming. Maybe I would say it was very possible that both things were happening. The river operations were handled by experienced woodmen from Maine, many of whom reportedly married young ladies from the area and raised their families here. In February of 1879, the Boston Mill Company Board of Directors met in Cincinnati. The reason for the meeting was kept hush-hush. The Daily Commonwealth reported that this enterprise, once a gigantic one, had dwindled to slender proportions, their words. not doing probably 1/3 of the work as in former years. And it gave the reasons for the decline as being large salaries paid to the officers, disasters by the Licking River's rampages, terrible damage done to piers and to booms. And it also went on to say that the general business of the mill had probably been impacted by smaller mills that had sprung up in the area. But they went a step further to say that they thought the major reason for the decline was that the management was not on site. It was distant management. It claimed that the remote management wasn't able to judge the Licking River's waywardness and uncertainty. I like the terms they use there. Not much has changed, has it, with the Licking River? We could still use those terms to define it. And it also cited there were other issues, but they thought this one was probably a big one. It went on to say that the local men in charge were competent, but even they couldn't combat the river's sudden uprising unless they were empowered to rebuild pretty much what the river had destroyed, you know, fallen piers and booms that needed to be strengthened. And even then, if they were able to do this, that the chances would be against them. In the end, the company decided to dissolve, and their reason for the dissolution was because bringing logs 300 miles down the river was not practical. So they decided to move the operation down the Ohio River and continue operating from there. It was at this time that C.C. Hagemyer purchased the Boston Mill. When he bought the equipment, he believed that he let it be known that he believed his experience in Eastern Kentucky would bring him success. He had learned while he was there to be self-reliant. There was nobody else he could count on. So he felt that self-reliance would improve his chances of making a go at this. In December of the same year, which is 1879, the Covington Daily Commonwealth reported that during the summer, it was feared that the Boston Mill was a played-out institution. It reported that it now believed that the old mill still had many years left in its life. It went on to state that C.C. Hagemyer had taken up residence in Butler. The 2 new piers had been built and various other improvements had been made to the town. It reported that 15,000 logs were waiting in a boom in the Licking to float from the mountains, and that more were being added to the boom daily, indicating the business was picking up. In 1881, Hagemyer moved the mills to Butler and changed the name to the Butler Mills. And this is a map of, it's the 1884 lake map, or the precinct map for Butler. And I wanted to just kind of point out in 1884 where Hagemyer's holdings were located. Here is the bridge coming over US 20, or coming over the Licking River there into Butler. Here is one piece of property. It's a saw and a grist mill owned by C.C. Hagemyer and Company. This is, I believe, probably, or it's definitely in the vicinity of, if it's not exact same lot, that the old firehouse is on. It's now the community center. Then on the other side of the bridge, we see Hagemyer over here and Company. He has 2 lots, and I think that's probably in the vicinity of the daycare. God's Little Explorers, I believe, is in there. Next door to them is Dr. W.A. Bradford, and then there's more Hagemyer and Company property over here in the corner. As you can tell, it doesn't outline a lot of buildings. I'm not sure if that was all there were at that time, or if that's just all they put on the map. Again, because it's a precinct map. So C.C. Hagemyer and Company was the official name of the company that owned the Butler Mills. So it operated under the name of Butler Mills, but it was owned by C.C. Hagemyer and Company. The mills included flour, lumber, and planing mills, and they were among the largest operations of such kind in this area. By 1898, they employed about 60 people. The officers at that time were C.C. Hagemyer himself, who was the president and the treasurer, C.F. Peoples, who was vice president, and C.P. Hagemyer, the son of Christian C. Hagemyer, was the secretary. The capacity of the flour mill was 100 barrels a day, and their brands were the Climax, the Imperial, the Monarch, and the Diamond. Those were flour brands that they carried. These brands were popular locally, as well as Cincinnati and points south of here. I also have a picture of the same property, or two of the same properties anyway, from the 1910 Sanborn map. Sanborn was a company who made these maps that could be used by insurance companies to insure a property against fire. So if you go to the Library of Congress website, you can get these maps in color. You can also find them in black and white, and I used the black and white because I thought the words would show up better. Neither was a good choice. So if you want to look further at this, you can go to the Library of Congress and see them in color. Different colors denoted what the building was made from. So wood would have a different color from brick or from stone, and so on. It would also to give you information like how the building was heated, if it had electric, if there was a night watchman on guard, or more than one. These were all considered things that would determine your rate for insurance, for fire insurance. And these words that we can barely read often give you those details about, whether there's a watchman or how close a water source is, if there's a cistern on the property, those kinds of things. And in this case, the river being there would have been an asset probably, as far as getting a good rate. Let's see. So timber at this time was still coming from the hills of eastern Kentucky, and it was still being rafted down the Licking River. The lumber mill had a capacity for a daily cut of 25,000 feet, and Hagemyer and Company were the largest shippers of lumber to all points north and south along the L&N Railroad. The planing mill was reportedly well equipped with the latest and best woodworking machinery. They had branched, by this time they also, by 1898, had developed branches located in Cynthiana and in Covington. So the business was growing, it was expanding. On the next slide, we see the header of the statement. This was a monthly statement, so if you owed money, you would get one of these from the company. It shows across the top who is now on the board. We have C.C. Hagemyer as the president, W.A. Bradford was the vice president and treasurer, and C.P. Hagemyer is still the secretary. This, as I said, just the header of the Butler Mills. As you can well imagine, the business eventually did start to decline again. As it was beginning to decline, Hagemyer established the H.L. Mickle Lumber Company. That's Mickle, M-I-C-K-L-E. This company had offices in Erlanger and in Cincinnati, and they specialized in yellow pine. At the time of Hagemyer's death, he was one of the oldest yellow pine wholesalers in the country. Shortly before discontinuing the business in Butler, he turned his attention to developing timber holdings that he had acquired in Tennessee. This firm in Tennessee was known as the Tennessee Lumber and Coal Company. So he, again, had expanded his business even out of the state, out of the territory. He served several years as the president of the Lumbermen's Club of Cincinnati, and Hagemyer was also the first president of the Yellow Pine Wholesalers Association. Christian Hagemyer was married twice. This is his second wife. His first wife was Mary Hall, and he married her in 1876 and had 6 children with her. After her death, he married Martha Wiley, and they had 2 daughters. Hagemyer died in 1920 at the age of 71. The Hagemyers were active members in the Methodist Church at Butler. In fact, upon his death, he left a sizable portion of his estate to the church. He was very instrumental in getting the new brick church built that was located on High Street. It was built in 1917. Hagemyer took a failing business, and within what really was a short period of time, he turned it around. He was able, over a period of time, to expand it. He employed more people, and he even added new businesses and endeavors as well. He was certainly an entrepreneur of his time, and his company provided quite an economic boom to the local economy. So he was truly an entrepreneur. This concludes the little section on Hagemyer, and we are going to move on now to Joseph M. Lowe, or Joseph Macaulay Lowe. He had a political career, but he was also a visionary, and I think, at least in terms of what research I was able to dig up on him, his visionary endeavors are really what he made his name in doing, in pursuing. This is the outline I'm going to follow. We'll talk a little bit about his early life. We'll talk about his years in the Civil War. We'll talk about his legal career, other endeavors he was involved in, and then the big endeavor, I think, is the National Old Trails Road Association, which he got involved in later on in his life and was involved in at the time of his death. Lowe wrote, this picture of him, by the way, was taken around 1920, which would have been a few years before he died. Lowe wrote briefly about his childhood in a 70-page booklet that he entitled An Idle Hour in Life's Pilgrimage. This book is just a gem if you are interested in knowing what your family may have lived through if they were born in the 1840s or 1830s even. It gives you a good example of what's going on in Pendleton County, of how people were living and what they did. In this book, for example, he talks about getting a half-day holiday from farm work on Saturdays. And he said that he and the local boys would take that opportunity whenever the weather was in their favor to swim in Jack Hand's mill pond on the Fort Lick. The mill pond was not far from the Lowe homestead. Sometimes the boys would even swim in the Licking River at present-day Morgan. He talks about climbing trees in the orchard on the family farm. And he talks about, in this book, he talks about making sugar from the maple sap that was tapped from local trees. During this seemingly carefree time, he didn't know that in just a few short years, things would change, but they did. And I think I failed to tell you that he was from Callinsville. He was born on the 13th of December in 1844, the 8th child out of 10 born to his parents, who were Moses Lowe and Nancy Porter Lowe. When he was 13 years old, his father died. His education was limited to just the little one-room schools out at Callinsville. And in the summer of 1862, Callinsville resident and one-time county clerk, Tom Moore, who, if you are a Moore researcher, he's Thomas Edwin, or T.E. Moore, was recruiting a company of cavalry for the Confederate Army. J.M. Lowe and many boys and men from this area joined this company. Lowe's biography in it's a book called Battles and Biographies of Missourians, reported that he was a courier for the Confederate Army. He enlisted at the age of 16. He was almost 17. He enlisted in the fall of 1862. He would have been 17 or just about 17 in that winter. It further stated that he once carried an important dispatch from Richmond, Virginia to the Cumberland Gap. This dispatch was written on tissue paper, and it was folded up so small that it would fit in the fingertip of a glove. And that's how he carried the message, was in the fingertip of his glove. He was never caught, but he did encounter some close calls, according to this biography. It did not give us details, unfortunately. I think that would have been a really cool story, but we didn't get it. In 1921, he was appointed director of the Missouri Confederate Home, and according to a Missouri newspaper, his Confederate service was questioned by an adversary. This adversary wanted that position, and he had written to Washington, D.C., trying to get a copy of the military record of J.M. Lowe, and was not able to do that. I've not been able to find one either, so my guess is that it never got to Washington. At the time, those records were sent to Richmond, Virginia. And as the troops were closing in on Richmond, some of those records were destroyed. Some of them never got to Richmond. They were kept with the camp. And who knows what happened to them then. Eventually, after the war was over, there was an effort made to round those up and to get them into Washington. And he just doesn't have a record there. But Captain Tom Moore came to the rescue, and he set the record straight. Lowe had asked him to send a letter telling them that he served, and Moore stated that Lowe had served for 7 months and was discharged due to illness. I have a map of Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and over here would be Virginia. While Lowe was in the Confederate Army, he would have been in Virginia and Tennessee and the eastern part of Kentucky, because that regiment did do service in that area. When he got out, he went to Indiana, and he was probably right along in here. He went to Greenfield, which is in Hancock County. At the age of 19, he was teaching and reading the law in the evening under the tutelage of James L. Mason. From 1864 to 1866, he was a clerk in the Indiana Senate and was accepted to the Indiana Bar in 1866. He ran for prosecuting attorney of Hancock County in 1867 and was defeated. So the next year, he leaves this area and he heads to Missouri. And continues to practice law. In 1872, he was elected the Clinton County prosecuting attorney, and he held that position for 4 terms. That brings us, this is a picture of him that was probably taken around the time he went to Missouri, maybe a few years after he had been there, probably in the 1870s, 1880s, that this picture was taken. No later than the mid-1880s, I would say. In 1885, Lowe was elected circuit judge. 10 years later, he was appointed commissioner of the Board of Elections. He was also appointed about 10 years after his circuit judgeship. He was appointed the receiver of the National Exchange Bank. The National Exchange Bank had gone under, as we would say, and he was the overseer and the manager of the assets of the bank, and he was able to get the depositors all their money back, and the stockholders were able to receive a dividend. In 1900, he ran for lieutenant governor of Missouri and again was defeated in that endeavor. He was not easily defeated, okay? Besides a legal career, Lowe was a sought-after speaker, having spoken on Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee on more than one occasion. In fact, the speech on Thomas Jefferson is in the back of the little book I was talking about, An Idle Hour in Life's Pilgrimage. The groups that he spoke for included the United Daughters of the, included the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Democratic Club of Kansas City. Between 1906 and 1922, the land in the house that we know today as the Rice Tremonti House was owned by Judge Joseph M. Lowe and his son, J. Roger Lowe. The marker commemorating the rice plantation was dedicated on May 15, 1913. His granddaughter, Florence, the daughter of Roger, described growing up there as, in this old house surrounded by orchards and farm fields. So you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't keep him out of the country, right? The Lowes, father and son, farmed this land, and they renovated the house the first time it was renovated. As a visionary, J.M. Lowe brought salmon to Missouri. In April of 1881, he received 10,000 salmon from the Fish Commission. The salmon were reported to be about 3 inches long and about a year old. Half of them total were placed in the deep water of Smith's Fork near Plattsburgh Mineral Spring in Missouri, and the other half was near the Walker Chalybeate Spring. When his brother Frank died in 1885, he owned land in both Kentucky and Missouri. He left his Missouri land and his holdings and assets in Missouri to J.M. Lowe and J.M.'s children. This included a rather large herd at that, of Galloway cattle. Lowe and this is an ad that came out of one of the papers. Lowe and his son liquidated the herd about 10 years after they got it. So around 1895. So they stayed in the cattle business for about 10 years. I don't know about you all, but it talks about 12 two-year-old bulls and 20 yearling bulls with a balance of cows and heifers. I would think if you have 20 yearling bulls and 12 two-year-olds, that's 32 bulls. You have quite a few cows and heifers, I would think, still in your stock at that time, but it gives their addresses there as well. And as I said, this ad appeared in several newspapers in Missouri and other states during the time that they were liquidating their stock. Excuse me a minute, I got my pages out of date. Okay, the next slide is on the National Old Trails Road Association. Once again, this is the visionary bug that's hitting him. During the 1890s, Lowe became interested in an ocean-to-ocean national highway. He had long been a proponent of good roads, despite the fact, as he once told the U.S. Senate Committee on Post Offices and Post Roads, he never owned a car. And in his words, he wouldn't know what in the dickens to do with it if he had one. His proposal was simple. It was to connect the old trails that were used during the time of westward expansion and make a national road out of them. He also wanted to macadamize the roads, which would improve the road quality. It's a little more complicated than the description I'm going to give you, but when you macadamize a road, you enable it to drain, the water to drain off of it when it gets wet. They would dig ditches down the sides of the road, and the water would drain into it because the center of the road is higher than the sides of the road, as much as 3 inches. So that allowed the water to run off. And the theory behind that was if you could keep the water off the road and it didn't sit in the road, it reduced the amount of maintenance that you needed. In 1912, he and other forward-thinking men formed the National Old Trails Road Association in Kansas City. On this slide, I have a map up here, and the dark line going all the way across is the path of the Old Trails Road, the National Highway. It was just linking the old trails that went through these states. When the association was founded, he was elected as president, and in his acceptance speech, he admonished those in attendance to, and I quote, "Keep your eye toward the sunrise and your wagon hitched to a star. We stand upon the threshold of mighty achievement." The purpose of the association was to promote the improvement of a transcontinental trail from Baltimore to Los Angeles with branches in New York and San Francisco. Lowe was the president of the association from the time of its founding until he died in 1926. He was then replaced by Harry Truman. Truman wrote about this position, about this job, and he said it was kind of like running for president of the United States, except that other people were promising him something instead of him making promises. And he also stated it was a very demanding job. Lowe traveled, particularly in these states where this line goes through, trying to garner support for the highway. The National Old Trails Association sold memberships as a principal means of gathering revenue for their work. So they were kind of like a motor club of the time. Lowe traveled in all this, as I said, all those states, and he spoke with governors and legislatures, urging them to contribute money to the cause. He also spoke before Congress, suggested the license plate. This is the guy who got us the license plate, okay? I'm sure there were others involved in it too, but the credit goes to him. His idea was that you could sell the plate, collect the fees, and the fees would enable the states to finish the roads, because some states were having a hard time coming up with the money to finish the trail, turn it into a road that went through their state. Because, well, you can see, like in some of these states here, it goes all the way across the state. So it did take a lot of money and a lot of time. So the fees could help do that. And then once the roads were built, the fees would continue to provide a fund where the roads could be then repaired as needed. In 1926, part of the National Old Trails Road extending from Las Vegas in New Mexico all the way out to Los Angeles in California was certified US Highway 66, better known as Route 66. And a section of the road in the St. Louis, Missouri area was also certified as part of Route 66. So it's kind of an interesting little twist there. If you've ever traveled Route 66, you may very well have been on the National Old Trails Road. Lowe wrote a book entitled The National Old Trails Road, The Great Historic Highway of America, and the book was about the work of the association. You can find it on the internet as well. I believe Internet Archive has it, and you can read it online there, or you can download it in a PDF format if you're interested in looking at it a little closer. And this right down here, the second picture, is what the sign looked like that marked the highway. Let people know this is the Old Trails Road Association's work. And some of those are still floating around out there. If you're on eBay, you can see some of the originals. In March of 1876, J.M. Lowe married Mary Elizabeth McWilliams. She was a native of Richmond, Kentucky, and they were married in Pendleton County, Missouri. They had 2 children. I previously have named J. Roger Lowe. They also had a daughter, Florence Lowe Bryant. Joseph Macaulay Lowe died on the 16th of April in 1926 in Kansas City, Missouri. Imagine seeing the need for a highway that you would never drive on. Imagine the vision it required to think of a license plate as a means to get such a highway and to maintain it. imagine the tireless amount of energy that had to go into this endeavor. And it's for us to still benefit from it today. Macadamized roads are still the thing. I think from all of this that you can say that in all he did, J.M. Lowe truly did hitch his wagon to a star and work tirelessly for the general good of all of us. In summing up, both of these men, C.C. Hagemyer and J.M. Lowe, in their own way, made an amazing contribution to the world they lived in and to the time in which they lived. Much of their work is still evidenced, while some of it has been lost to what I call the sands of time. Either way, it's incredible to see the impact the Pendleton Countyans have had on our community, our state, but also on our country. I thank you so much today for tuning in and watching this program. I hope that you gained something from it that you didn't know before. I encourage you to check back on Saturday because, as I said earlier, we will be talking about Samuel T. Hauser and Luther Kennett, both born and spent their early years in the town of Falmouth. So again, I thank you for joining us. We'll see you on the next segment. Bye-bye.